Hi, my name is Cynthia Demise. I'm the project manager of the new Pride Agenda. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, we may have met a few of you when Doug Worth, one of our board co-chairs are Doug Worth and Cecilia Gentili, came to Buffalo last fall to be able to introduce ourselves and explain why, after months of sort of consideration, we were starting the new Pride Agenda. And it's a pretty simple explanation. We just felt that many of us were stunned at Empire State Pride Agenda closing, and felt that there was a tremendous amount of work yet to be done, particularly with transgender, non-conforming, non-binary communities, people of color, people of less means. And so we decided to do some organizing and begin to rebuild a very focused education advocacy organization that'll hopefully help young people also evolve in terms of leadership and service. So we kind of officially began last July, July of 19. We have a board of directors of 10 people, and we're going to expand that to 15 or 20. Our intent was to expand it rather quickly and return to Buffalo in the spring of this year. But of course, COVID hit, and all our programming and all our focus, as with many nonprofits, was entirely changed. Regarding advocacy, we began last fall to work very hard on implementation issues of laws that were not, in our view, being adequately implemented. And we led the way in terms of the governor's office making a decision to do mandated training for all 340,000 state employees on understanding gender. We are supportive of the efforts of the state to do regional training now regarding gender. We're going to continue that focus as we go forward into this legislative session. Regarding education, we had originally planned on going into some high density queer communities in New York City, and then upstate and Long Island and Westchester. That, of course, had to also, that's going to start in April of last year. So we immediately pivoted to virtual town halls. We focused the first couple months on COVID and then moved to other issues: Black Lives Matter, police reform, immigration, economic equity, etc. We've had 2,000 people watching these virtual town halls, a huge outpouring of interest and support. And so we're going to continue them as far as the eye can see until we're able to be in person in the community again. We also have developed an LGBTQ survey, which we have sent out to our listservs. We have the results. Our next virtual town hall, which is going to be October 14th, will begin to feature the results of that survey with a number of excellent panelists, and it's going to focus on civic engagement and how we can help our community get more involved. So with that all being said, I'm going to pass off to our right-hand man, Ahmed Mohamed, to introduce our panelists and tell a little bit more about how the virtual town hall will work today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Ahmed Mohamed. I'm Civic Engagement and Community Organizer with the new Pride Agenda. Tonight, we'll be talking about LGBTQIA matters of Buffalo. We have a stellar panel, and I'm excited to allow them to introduce themselves in a second. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge that we were supposed to be joined by Ari Moore. Unfortunately, she had to cancel last minute, and we hope to connect with her in the future. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that some of the questions we will be talking about tonight speak to different demographics in our community. And although this panel doesn't represent the entirety of our community, and we don't purport to speak for those demographics, namely transgender people and women, we do hope to lend our voices to their cause as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves before we get into the questions, and we'll start off with Damian.
Hi, I'm Damian Mordecai. I'm the Executive Director of the Pride Center of Western New York, which is an affiliate of Evergreen Health. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been with the Pride Center for about 13 years now.
Thank you, Damian. Dejan.
Good evening. My name is Dejan Hall. I'm the manager of the MOCHA Center Buffalo, a member of the Trillium Health family. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm really thankful to be a part of this conversation tonight.
Thank you. Robert.
Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Roush, and I'm the Executive Director of GLYS Western New York, where we are growing LGBTQ youth support. And I've been in my position really only 1 year, and I had been out of Buffalo for 30 years and this position was open as I was considering moving back to Buffalo. And as they say, the rest is history.
Thank you. And Victor Sanchez, an MPA board member, will be co-moderating us with me tonight. And so, Victor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. So my name is Victor Sanchez. I am on the board of the New Pride Agenda, and I am actually located in Rochester. So I am one of the only board members right currently in New Pride Agenda that's outside of like the New York City area, which hopefully we hope to change soon. And I'm looking forward to learning more about Buffalo and having this conversation with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And so before we dive into the questions, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. We hope for this to be as interactive as possible. And so please ask questions using the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen. And even if you don't have a question but would like to comment, please also insert those in the chat function along the bottom. If you would like to see everyone's face at the same time and not just the speaker, you can change that by clicking on gallery view, upper right-hand corner of your screen. And without further ado, let's get to the questions. We're first going to be focusing on the issue of police reform and Black Lives Matter movements. And so, Dejan, I would like to start off with you. How have you experienced the Buffalo community come together in recent weeks and months amid protests for police reform?
Let me start by saying I think it's beautiful to see this movement taking place here in the city of Buffalo. It's a long time overdue. I'm really encouraged by what I've seen over the past few months. Members of the LGBTQ community, folks from every walks of life gathering to call on the city to improve our policing systems and the way that we interact with our Black and Brown communities. We've seen over the past few months folks march, rally, conduct teach-ins, and celebrate in public while discussing very pressing and systemic issues in a way that I think is dragging the city closer to where it ought to be. Yeah.
Thank you. Damian, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I echo just what Dejan says. It really is just, especially with everything that happened in June, specifically, you know, a month that we refer to June as being Pride Month, and it was, to me, the most authentic that, you know, Pride has been in, in recent memory, you know. And so I think it is wonderful, you know, and not just like what's happening through the protests and what you're seeing online, but the way that people have felt empowered enough to begin to make some changes within companies and organizations. And you're seeing the way that, people that they're having dialogue. And I also echo what Dejan said about, like, you know, you really see folks dragging the city, you know, to make change. And it's inspiring. I'm inspired by a lot of the people and all of the different ways that they are showing advocacy and protest.
I'm sitting with like the word authentic that you just used, and I find it interesting because we hear you connected it to pride, and kind of pride, one of the huge criticisms of it is that it's like super corporate, and that like you don't actually are doing anything to advance the needs or rights of our community. And so can you elaborate a bit on that? Like, how do you see this as being more authentic? I think that would be like very interesting if you could share.
Sure. So one of the things that, I have, this has been an ongoing discussion. I think it happens annually at least. But the Pride Center, as former organizers of the Pride Festival in Buffalo, we have a diverse group of people that we work with, and like I said, we're an affiliate of Evergreen Health, and people have a lot of different ideas around corporations being involved in Pride, and who should be there, and what Pride looks like, and what it sounds like. And there are some folks that feel like, well, the corporations are there because of advocacy, because so many of these banks or larger companies give back to communities, and the LGBT people in those corporations are saying, hey, if you are giving to community X, you need to also be giving to my community as well. And so that shows up in Pride the way that we see it. Of course, some people are saying, well, this bank is only doing it because they want the pink dollars, and that is, there's truth to that. I'm sure that is one of the selling points that some of the employee resource groups, the LGBT resource groups, are using to get that buy-in. But I think for those folks, they're seeing it as, hey, this is my way of giving back to the community. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks say these companies don't care about the way that we love and worship and pray and rejoice and all of these. And so they have no place, in Pride, and something that was rooted in a riot and a fight, for equality and to be seen as we are. And so, but I felt there was a part of me that felt like we took that back this year. There wasn't, a corporate entity that sponsored it. It wasn't a single agency that, organized it. It was the people, and, for me, that's really what it should be like,
Right.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. I think one of the most specific examples I could think of to underscore Damian's point is a march that occurred in June that was hosted by the Allies for Black Justice. It was kind of symbolic in a sense. They marched up Elmwood in the opposite direction of the annual Pride parade hosted by the Pride Center. There were no police escorts. There were no corporations, just raw people. And the Allies for Black Justice is actually headed up by a queer Black man and some other members of the LGBTQ community. And I think that's beautiful, especially when we think about the history of Pride and its relation to the Stonewall riots. They correlate directly. Police brutality was at the root of what happened in New York City, and it is at the root of what happened here in June. So I'm really encouraged, and I think that authenticity that Damian mentioned is still being felt and seen throughout the city today.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up that point, Dejan, because I was gonna ask about that, because I know in Rochester we had an event take place organized by LGBTQ members around the Stonewall anniversary. So it was kind of very fitting, and you're right, Damian. It felt really authentic to kind of go back to those roots of activism and being in the streets, fighting for rights. And I was encouraged to hear that there was an organization kind of ran by LGBTQ members. There's most of the organizing in Rochester is led by LGBTQ people. So I was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on that, and also how do we assure that kind of LGBTQ members stay at the focus of this movement, specifically, our trans members.
This is a freebie. So whoever wants to take it first.
Well, I don't know if this really answers the question, but I'm kind of thinking about when things happen. And the thing that comes to mind for me in the LGBTQ movement, when it was truly a moment of the people, like we're talking about, was when Matthew Shepard was, basically crucified on a fence. And we all poured out to the streets, whatever town we were in. I was living in Allentown, Pennsylvania at the time. So I think it's really unfortunate that the energy for some of this comes from such tragedy. And I think that's the case with Black Lives Matters, that when tragedies happen, this is what brings people out to support things and to really understand that there's a cause there underneath things. So when we're out on the street in the pride parades and in our booths and selling our rainbow things, it doesn't seem like there's really important issues at stake. So I think it's a careful balancing act, and maybe, we need to remind people on a regular basis of what the history is. So, October being History Month, I think we really do need to talk about that history and try and get out there and just focus on that for at least a month, like October.
Mm-hmm.
To the question about representation, I think to Dr. Roush's point about history, Black Lives Matter was founded by a group of queer Black women. And the movement all over the country seems to be by and large led by queer Black folks, including here in the city of Buffalo. We're no different. And one of the things I'm encouraged by is that I think, yes, we are responding to trauma and oppressive systems, but we are also taking steps to educate the community on what that history is and what those systems are and what we can do to improve not just the systems that exist today, but also reimagine what could be for tomorrow. So in response to like police brutality, the language around that has been centered on what does public safety look like in our communities today, and what steps can we take to reimagine it for tomorrow. And what that often looks like for folks who are active in Black Lives Matter is things like defunding the police in order to reinvest into community centers, very much like those represented on this call. Things like removing police officers from schools, because oftentimes what we've seen is young LGBTQ folks being bullied both verbally and physically, oftentimes taking similar actions to defend themselves, and having to deal with law enforcement in return for them just wanting to be left alone is problematic. I think a lot of the demands and calls for reform and abolition are rooted in solutions that that really get to the heart of what we experience as a queer community.
Mm-hmm. That was well put. It makes me think of, are there any, like the question that immediately comes in, do you guys have any legislative items? Like we have the education and doing the community work, but also holding our elected officials accountable and trying to see the change codified in law. So are there like specific legislative pushes that you guys would like to share that we could support or amplify that in Buffalo and across the state?
Well, earlier this week, the City of Buffalo's Common Council, which is our legislative body, passed Carriel's Law, which was named after a Buffalo police officer who was fired and lost her pension for intervening in what she deemed was excessive use of force. It was a long fight for Carriel's Law, which is a duty to intervene law, as well as a whistleblower protection law, but we finally got a victory, and that is due to the tireless work of those who took to the streets. Things that remain to be seen is, again, removing police officers from schools, which is something our school board would have to do. Divesting from our police force and investing into our community, AKA defund the police. Daniel's Law is something that we're also talking about here in Buffalo. It's from Rochester. After the death of Daniel Prue, there were calls to remove police from mental health first responding altogether. That's something that I've heard folks on the street call for here, especially after the shooting of Mr. Willie Henley a couple weeks ago here in Buffalo, who was shot by Buffalo police who were responding to a call about a man yelling. And then there's independent civilian oversight of our police department. Most other cities, Syracuse, Rochester, New York, have some form of civilian review over their police department's internal affairs. The city of Buffalo does not have strong independent review of their department, and folks on the street are rallying behind the Buffalo Police Advisory Board, who has created a two-pronged structure to address that gap.
Thank you. Does anyone else like to touch on legislative? If not, I can move on to the next question.
Well, I just wanted to quickly mention that I think there is a lot that could be done as far as law is concerned, but I think that we need to do a lot of work as far as a cultural change goes in order for those laws to even be ushered in, because what's really needed is a complete overhaul of the way we conceive of police work and what it is. And we can talk, and maybe we will talk about this a little bit more later on, but social workers in the social work field has always had a completely different approach and has been able to become, we have a large crisis services program in Western New York. If you go that route first, instead of calling 911, you call the crisis center, they will dispatch an individual that is trained in de-escalation and understands mental health concerns. And if, you know, we could get people to look at those kinds of successes and how that's the direction we need to go into and put more money into that. These things exist already, but they exist on separate tracks. And unfortunately, you can't send a policeman out with a social worker. I'm sorry, I said policeman, but I'm old. You can't send police out with a social worker, someone with a gun and a uniform, because that is going to kind of squelch the idea of de-escalation in the first place. So these types of huge cultural changes where people without weapons are going in to what someone thinks is a dangerous situation, but actually isn't, because they understand the behavior of the individuals that they're going to intervene with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
I want to add that, like, just the importance of getting involved and finding organizations, LGBT or not, who are fighting for the things that are important to us, because you know, there's a lot going on. I'm watching organizations locally like Push Buffalo, like you know, fighting against increases in utility costs and trying to make sure that, like, you know, folks don't end up homeless, you know, this winter because they can't make rent. There are things that we have been involved in through our partnerships with the centers, Rise Out, and the LGBT Health and Human Services Network, fighting, you know, for things like gender and those things. But there are other things that we have been focusing on, like increased access for affirming mental health services, thinking, you know, about LGBTQ plus long-term care facility residents' rights, restorative justice principles, you know, fighting against the gay trans panic defense. And then there are things that we have had wins on, but people don't even know, or there aren't enough teeth behind it to really even enforce it. And so I think we just really need folks to get involved and really and hold organizations like ours accountable. Hold your representatives accountable. That's how like we're gonna get that. That's how change is gonna happen.
Great. I appreciate those comments. I'm going to take a question from the audience. It kind of speaks to some of the stuff we've been discussing. And so I would be remiss to ask this question without acknowledging that Stonewall was led by a Black trans woman, Marsha P. Johnson. And so there's a long history of Black queer folks being at the forefront of our fight for liberation. We talked about earlier how in Buffalo, there are Black queer folks to this day leading this fight over the summer, which is an encouraging sign. We still see some divides between those two communities, however. And so, Dijon, I want to come to you first. How do you think we could build some of those bridges actively without tragedy? I think is a crucial point, and like proactively just build that sort of relationship and foster it. It's a loaded one. It's a loaded
question. I'm not going to lie. It's a very difficult one, and I don't know I can answer it without, I think, calling out some of the problems that exist within the LGBTQ community. As you pointed out, Stonewall and early prides were mostly led by Black and brown folks, but somewhere along the way, that got co-opted, and the fight for and push for LGBTQ rights became centered on queer white men. And we see that very much here in the state of New York, for example, when gay marriage was legalized, most of the LGBTQ activists packed it up and went home because their concerns were answered. However, the intersectional sort of approach that Black queer folks have been taking has been something that they've never stopped fighting for, right? Damian brings up great points around addressing things like housing, poverty, and mental health services. Those fights have largely been within Black communities and within Black LGBTQ communities. My concern is not so much the divide between the Black and LGBTQ community, because I'm not certain that that divide is as great as it's made out to be. I think my concern is ultimately with those who have been privileged and why they sort of walk away instead of fighting with Black and brown queer folks who are pushing for a future that I think will benefit everyone. I hope that answered it.
No, that was very well said. I appreciate those 2 cents. Does anyone else want to say anything in general on this topic? I missed, perhaps, if we're moving on to a completely different but important one. Damian, go ahead.
Yeah, we know that trans women of color have led the riots at Stonewall, catalyzing a whole national movement. And before that, they were the ones that spurred the Compton cafeteria riots before that. And so I think we're used to, as an LGBT community, people, organizations, we're used to organizing and demanding equity and respect for our lives. And I think, one of the things that as an LGBT organization and leading an LGBT organization and acknowledging places like the MOCHA, Center, MOCHA project before that, didn't just happen because someone wanted, to do it. I think it's important to acknowledge that many organizations, including, ours, we have to acknowledge that while our work is bound up with movements, for racial healing and justice, and that many of our members of our organization have shown up in support of these movements, we historically haven't done enough to align our missions with the work for racial justice. And so I think as allies, you know, for anyone wondering like what to do, I think for allies to this movement, the first job is to listen and to ask how we can support, you know, organizations like Black Lives Matter, like the MOCHA Center, community access services, local chapters of the NAACP, and other organizations that are taking the lead to end racially based or biased violence here in Buffalo. And so I think it's not so much to, I think it's, you know, first to listen and then to act, and to not just come in recommending strategies and so forth. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah, back in 1969, we didn't refer to the leaders as trans women of color because we didn't have that terminology, and trans really wasn't a term at all in 1969. And so when you heard the history 25 years ago, you heard that it was led by the drag queens. And so the truth is that there were both trans people there and drag queens there, but we didn't understand what the differences were. And I don't want to create a theme by talking about this separate track thing, but the reality with the white men of white collar had their own organizations, and this goes back to Buffalo too, when they created what was called the Mattachine Society. And those were professional white men, and they didn't really go out into bars and do things. There was a period of 2 years when the bars were actually closed down in Buffalo, when they went through all that Vice Squad stuff in this city, similar to what was going on in New York City at the same time. So it kind of was that the blue collar individuals were creating community around the bars, where the white collar white men were creating this community within their own organizations and going out to dinner and meeting in one another's homes and that sort of thing. So again, you get this idea that things are on separate tracks, and I'm not trying to create a theme around this, but the reality is, yeah, you get this sense that there's a disinterest from one group to the other group. And bridging the gap is just simply coming out and meeting other individuals. Now, that kind of division didn't really remain because the bar culture actually did expand much more. But then you have bars that were racially segregated in Buffalo and in New York City, of course, that started emerging out of this. So, you know, the solution to that, again, I'm going to sound like I'm just singing one note, is basically aiming at cultural change, you know, so that we are inclusive. And until we become inclusive, we're just not going to get to that next step. And this is not something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. There are places in Europe that we can look at to see this sort of thing working much better than what's going on in the United States right now.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I feel like we could talk about this subject entire Zoom event, but I'm going to move on just so we can cover as much ground as we can. And the next segment is going to be on COVID-19 and health disparities. And so in response to COVID-19, how have you guys seen Buffalo queer community offer support to the most vulnerable? And we know that although like it seems that the virus has gone away because it's not always on the media, that it's still ravaging certain communities, and people are still reeling economically from the destruction that it's caused. And so I want to offer this as an open question. Whoever wants to start us off, I hope to hear all three perspectives. Is it easier if I pick on somebody?
Well, I'll start. I mean, our organization, deals with youth, so we deal with the very young. We had just started a gender expansive group for kids as young as age 5. I don't think we had any 5-year-olds come, but we did have some 8-year-olds come to that group. And unfortunately, when COVID came, that evaporated because the younger the children, the more protective really everyone feels of them. And they certainly don't want to bring them into an environment that could be dangerous. So our services, for many months, we didn't have any in-person groups or services. And in May, we restarted them when we were able to get outdoors again. And then we were only running, 3 groups once a month, and we're still on that schedule. So what we worried a lot about was gay youth being at home and in a very unsupportive environment and having to be there all day and all night and all week and all month and all the next month. So we have found that this has caused some issues. We offer a youth and care program where we visit inpatient and outpatient mental health facilities in order to support the LGBTQ youth. And by the way, a stunning statistic is that for adolescents, inpatient mental health care, 80% at Child Psychiatric Center in West Seneca identify as LGBTQ. So these are big problems that are not going away. Has the pandemic exacerbated them? If you talk to the statistics people for suicide and self-harm attempts, they're saying, well, they're not seeing a real clear trend. But I do know at our agency, we don't usually get 1 suicide attempt per month. And we've been having about, news of and providing some sort of support for that kind of thing each month. And we do think it's the strain. So we feel, unfortunately, we feel kind of powerless in a lot of ways, but we do the best that we can over the phone, on Zoom, and if we can, we meet with them, in a safe, socially distanced environment. But the institutions have not allowed us back inside yet because of their own rules and regulations. So it has provided a great strain on the community, and it has disconnected us from our constituency. So, unfortunately.
Thank you. Damian, would you like to go?
Sure. So we too, just like pretty much everyone, moved what services we could remotely or virtually throughout COVID. Almost immediately, I think we started with doing check-ins with our seniors because we know that seniors, specifically LGBT seniors, social isolation is already an issue. And so we were worried that many of them wouldn't be able to connect virtually. And so, and they were already, because of being seniors, they're already at a higher risk. And we just wanted to check in. Surprisingly, and luckily, many of them actually were able to connect, virtually. They had access to phones and knew how to use, quickly learned how to use Zoom, and we're helping each other through all of that. We did see there were quite a few different kinds of actually, I've been forwarding and sending folks to GLYS. A lot of parents, I think, recognizing a need for help for their kids or for themselves. A lot of them just saying like, I want to be there for my kid, but I'm struggling through this. So I think like there were a lot of conversations that maybe were forced, or maybe just people had the time to have those. But you know, again, virtual groups, we did do, we were able to do and are still doing at-home HIV testing, sending those kits out, delivering kits to folks if they needed. We're slowly in the process of introducing, you know, one-on-one appointments at the Pride Center. We did reopen our building, and we are going to be hopefully introducing some small group meetings, and you know, in the near future, hopefully, you know, COVID, we don't get this second wave of it, but yeah, we've been maintaining a lot of virtual groups in the meantime, and we will actually continue to do those going forward because we do serve 8 counties, and we have access to you know, transportation has always been an issue for as long as, you know, I've been doing this work for many people. So now that we have kind of this infrastructure, we want to build on that and make sure that we continue to offer virtual services going forward.
Yeah. The question of how the community has offered support to our most vulnerable, much like Damian, the Pride Center, MOCHA staff has been calling and checking in on those who frequent our site. And what we found was in part kind of inspiring. A lot of folks don't know, but most of Buffalo's homeless population, I think it's around 52%, identifies as queer in some form or another. And that number is disproportionately affecting young Black and Brown LGBTQ folks. MOCHA has a number of clients who currently experience homelessness, poverty, and other sort of ACEs, if you will. But when we called, we're seeing that our clients are supporting each other and their families are supporting each other. There are those who may not have had a home prior to COVID suddenly staying with other folks. And that sort of communal response to an emergency is, I think, what folks mean when they say redefine safety and re-envisioning what community public safety looks like. So that's how I think we've been supporting one another. It's just being there when folks are in need. MOCHA as an agency, as an institution, has also been sending out HIV and STI testing kits. We've been delivering condom kits, lube, packets of information around sex and COVID, as well as face masks. We recently reopened our food pantry because COVID has left a lot of the city without the means to purchase their own food. So we've been making sure that we're disseminating food to those in need. We just reopened for one-on-one testing, and we're hoping to reopen for group work in the near future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of innovative solutions that you've all touched on that I think are going to continue to stay past COVID. That, you know, of a way to kind of outreaching to a larger audience, like telemedicine and the support services of Damian that you described, which I think is great. And Dejan, one of the things that you touched on was kind of like how the homeless population is, you know, such a large number is LGBTQ. And one of the things that I think COVID has brought to a lot of people's minds and kind of highlighted is kind of those disparities that exist in our communities. So what are some of the other kind of things that you have seen in the community that you can talk about? And I'll start with Dejan again to go back to him.
Come back to me. Let me think through the question. Sorry.
Jamie, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because this is actually almost like a daily conversation with some of our people, because it's interesting. There are some people that are still very much, and I see this with some, specifically with some of our seniors, that are still very much afraid. This is not true for everyone, however, because in some of the conversations about bringing some folks back to small group meetings, there were conversations around our Civil Pride project. Like, some of them are ready to get together, but there are just certain realities around, like, who's highest at risk, and like what kind of message does that send if an organization is welcoming back certain folks, because some people are not afraid. And you do see, I know that, like, our, no shade, gay bars are back open, and people are, they're going. And so, there are some people that are afraid, and there are some people that are not afraid. I think it's important for us to continue letting people know that there are a lot of people that I think all of us serve, who are compromised, who do have to know, and that they have to take care of themselves, and keep letting folks know, like, what the risks are for coming, trying not to encourage those group gatherings, but knowing the reality is that people want to get together and they really need those, like, connections. And so I think it's a constant conversation around, like, what are our current community norms, and what safety precautions can we take to make sure that we keep meeting the needs, and they're always changing. We have actually had quite a few younger folks, unfortunately, who are reaching out to us saying, that they're staying with their parents. It's not safe for them. They're currently on, they've been furloughed or are receiving unemployment, and are realizing that, they're getting the word that they're maybe not going to be returning, and feel like, I can't stay here any longer. Can you help me with housing? Housing is going to be a major thing, and it already was. And I'm really afraid, honestly, for a lot of our folks.
Robert, would you like to add to that?
Well, and the issue of homelessness, with homeless youth, 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. Now, we've had a little luck in Buffalo recently. There's a YHDP program, and I'm forgetting what the letters mean exactly, but it is a youth program to address homeless youth, and there are several shelters and mental health organizations in the area that are involved in that. And there are three main components to it. One is, of course, immediate shelter for homeless individuals. We kind of had some situations where some youth wanted to leave home in order to live together with their new boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, and which is not really appropriate for most shelter. But this new program also addresses families and trying to do some reparative work with families, because if a youth is homeless, there's something wrong going on at home. And there may be some sort of work that needs to be done to repair the relationship so that they can go back to living at home. And this is one of the first times we've actually put time and effort into that. And that is a huge repeating theme for us as well. And this kind of loops back to restorative practice. We are training in restorative circles in order to use those techniques for repairing families, and all of that works across the board for these issues. Most recently, through the youth justice department in New York State, we have been training and looking at healing-centered engagement, which is a little bit broader look. It not only addresses the trauma for the individual, but it addresses the trauma for the entire community, so that some of the people that are trying to help and give help have also been through the same type of trauma. And that is an incredibly important addition to how we approach all of these issues. So, and in addition to that, they have a drop-in center, sort of like a mid program, in order to get people from one place to another, either from the family program or into housing. And of course, permanent housing is the goal of any sort of homeless program. So the amount of that grant was $3.5 million. And that will help. It is aimed at the youth population. It will not, unfortunately, not necessarily help with individuals that are over 18 years of age. But I think that the age serves up to 21. I might be misspeaking on that. So there is a lot going on, and it is a really bad time to be homeless right now, especially bad.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate those comments. We're going to move on to the last segment of the night, so we can touch on LGBTQI representation in government. And to John, if I can come to you first, if you don't mind describing the state of play about LGBTQIA representation in Buffalo. Just to set the context, we've seen in the past year a 21% nationwide increase in LGBTQI representation in government, which is a reassuring sign, but we still have more work to do. And so can you describe the scene and then also talk about how we can further increase those numbers?
Sure. To my knowledge, in the city of Buffalo, only one elected official was openly identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community. So there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done there to get that much needed and much necessary, well, that's redundant, much needed representation here in the city of Buffalo. I actually had lunch with Mitch Nowakowski, who is the one openly queer person on our Common Council yesterday, to talk about, the barriers he perceives. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear that he hasn't actually had any barriers get in his way of being able to effectively do his job, which I think is extremely encouraging for our community, because there's nothing stopping us but us. If we can have more folks jump up and heed the call of leadership, I think we see a lot more progress in our city.
Damian, I would like to come to you to pick up on that point. Like, how do you think we can create more of an environment, I guess, or space for young leadership to feel empowered that it's their turn to take a seat at the table?
I think the representation matters. So the more that people see people that look like them in these positions, the more they're going to feel like that is attainable. And then I think even for the folks, for us, when we do recognize, because I recognize people high school, college age, who just have like that fire and that ability that they can do this. They can do really, really great things. And they need to hear it, because oftentimes, you'd be surprised just talking to some of these like kids, the way that they look at you when you tell them that they have the ability to do something. It's as if they've never heard that. And I don't know, it's sad. But I think, like we need to lift up those voices and get them involved and listen to them and get them, on our community advisory boards and really helping them getting, like I've seen one of the greatest examples of this actually, and I talk about this all the time because it almost seemed like staged almost. I was in the MOCHA Center in Rochester, And it was just shortly after school had ended. And these youth were coming in, and there was a group of trans women that were like coming in, and I had just gotten there, and there were youth that were, like going up to some of the employees saying, "Hey, I got that job," or "Hey, I just got my acceptance letter in the college," and like they're celebrating. And I'm like, this is just incredible. Like all of this is happening at the same time, that I was just like, people need to see this, see like the incredible like work that is like happening. And and I think that it's just like really helping our youth, and showing up. There are times, just today having a conversation with my boss, like there are times when I'm really uncomfortable with some of the aspects that I have to do with my job, and still I do it because I feel like there's just a lack of people that look like me in those areas, that I need to take advantage of this platform to show other Black and brown people that like we can do this, and so that's what I would say about that.
Powerful words. Makes me think, like, because we're also simultaneously trying to hold allies who aren't queer but in positions of power accountable to our community. And so how do we best do that at the same time?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that question? I want to make sure I heard it correctly.
No, for sure. Just for allies who aren't queer, but are in positions of elected power, how do we make sure that they understand what the lived experiences of queer folks are on the ground, and ensuring that that's reflected in their legislative priorities?
Yeah, I think Damian hit the nail on the head. We need to lift up and amplify voices of those in the community. I think the more voices you have sharing our experience and our barriers and what solutions we desire, the more likely you are to see the outcomes from our elected officials. But I also want to touch on something that I think I see as a problem outright, and that is the issue of identity versus belief sets, right? We have seen an increase in LGBTQ elected officials around the country, and certainly things are progressing, but perhaps not at the pace we would like. And I think part of what every community needs to do is really focus in on the value set of those who we are to vote for. Merely being LGBTQ is not enough. It's, are you LGBTQ and willing to invest serious time and influence in getting the sort of solutions that our community needs? And I would love to see more of our community holding not just our allies, but also those who are members of our community accountable.
Yeah, I just want to add that that's exactly one of the things that I think there's an assumption sometimes that if this person is LGBT, or if this person is a person of color, that they are going to be, they're just going to get it, and that they're going to advocate, for us. And that doesn't always happen. Like you see sometimes there is this experience comparison, like I made it, so you should be able to make it, or the other part of that is that sometimes, and I think like this is something that like I think some of us, need to recognize too, is that sometimes these folks are advocating, but there are systems, they are working in systems that are working against them. And some of that change doesn't come overnight, and it could really look like they're out here doing nothing for you, when really it's like they're fighting the fight, and it's really hard. And so just want to add that.
Yeah, I don't think in general politics is conducive to being able to recognize an ally, because as we all know, a politician will court the vote of the LGBTQ community, and you'll get the impression that they're an ally. possibly, but then if you talk to them, you find out that there's no actual knowledge or anything there. It's just kind of an approach. Because as far as voting blocks go, LGBTQ people are one of the few voting blocks left in the country as people spread in all directions. And I think recently our community has started spreading in all directions as well. So in order to really create an ally, you have to present some urgency with whatever the needs are and present that as something that is of benefit to the entire community. And that can be difficult to do. And I think also not to defend politicians, but they are being pulled in many different directions from many different groups, lobbying and trying to get their attention for this and that. And so some of the responsibility, I think, rests on us to kind of maybe unify some of these things which seem like separate topics, and say they're really not separate topics. We need the resources in order to solve many of these problems. And in many ways, the solutions are similar or actually the same thing. So if we can band together and figure out how to do that, we'll maybe get somewhere.
I think we also have sort of come full circle here back to the first topic, which was reform and Black Lives Matter. Some of the barriers that politicians face, and to Dr. Roush's point about just courting the vote and needing to present some sense of urgency. What is happening now in Buffalo and across this nation with regard to Black Lives Matter is a good example of what we can do when we stay on top of those who are elected and band together and prove that the community writ large desires the same outcome. I think the barriers that politicians exist oftentimes aren't as big as we think, because even the barrier might bend when they see thousands of people banding together for the same outcome. And when we pay attention to what politicians do, not just when they come to speak to us for our vote, but every day when they're on the job, when they're in their caucus meetings, when they're voting on the floor, monitoring those things, getting a sense of what they truly believe, and then coming to their doorstep with what we want, then I think we'll see more productivity out of those that we elect.
Yeah, I think that's all very important. I think definitely growing the representation of LGBTQ members in government is important, but I agree 100% that making sure that we hold our members accountable, not just, our allies, but also those that identify that are serving and there to serve. And one of the things is that the new Pride agenda is hopefully able to be, a strong partner in helping assuring that we have those conversations with elected officials and holding them accountable and working those relationships. And I'm just curious of how some of those relationships have been currently with some of the representatives of Buffalo. If you see some of that allyship truly there.
I will say that is a, well, it's not that it's a complicated question. It's one that has to be carefully answered, I guess. I think Dejan did say something that I, feel like, they definitely show up, when there is, is an election involved. But I think that something that, and I actually, I'm in communication with Dejan, with Robert and other like members of our community, leaders in our community. And something that I think like we've talked about and other people, I talk about is this idea that like we have different approaches and different ideas for how this work can be accomplished. And we can agree and we can disagree on certain things. And I think it's important to respect people's that difference. I think at the end of the day, I think we understand that we are working towards the same thing I would say, but have a different idea for maybe how to get there, or a different approach for how to get there. And we have to do them all, you know, like I'm just like, if Dejan is doing something and he makes, you know, more progress in that, good. Because we've gotten, you know, we're getting there. And I think that something that like I have experience with working with some of our local officials, statewide officials, is you have to communicate very differently with all of them, because certain things are important to one that is just not important. And there are times when it's not about the touchy-feely things, you know, like the things that, you know, we wouldn't talk about, like homeless. If you do this, we're able to house, you know, X amount of like youth or X amount of homeless people. It really comes down to, if you don't do this, this will cost, you know, our state or our region X amount. And so it ends up being money that is, you know, the motivating factor with some folks. And as much as you want to go online and be like, such and such only cares about this because the money is there, as an organization, it becomes very difficult. And that is where people are important, and grassroots organizations that aren't tied to state dollars, you know, is important. And that's why I think we all need to be in communication with each other, and strategizing and talking about, what is your approach? What are your strengths? What are, you know, how can I get involved? What phone calls? Because you may not be able to badmouth so-and-so, but I can, you know? And so I think more of that needs to happen. I see it happening more than I used to, but I think we need to build on that.
Dejan or Robert, would you guys like to add, or?
No, I think Damian hit the nail on the head there. It's the classic inside-outside game. We definitely need to see more of that.
Yeah, and I want to assure the community that's listening that the folks on this call really do know one another, and we do communicate with one another. And I think I'm gonna take a little risk here and make an announcement, Damian, that our organization, which will remain a separate organization, is actually taking up some space in the Pride Center, so that we can kind of work on some things a little bit more closely and try and bring the community a little bit closer together. There are some old things that stood in the way of that, and we've decided it's time to put those old things aside. And we, for example, would really love to see some sort of a program where the seniors are with the youth. This has worked in so many different places, and not necessarily LGBTQ youth and seniors. But the wisdom of our seniors is something that is not present for our youth, and it's something that our youth need. So that wasn't quite on the same wavelength, but I wanted to get that in there tonight.
No, thank you. Definitely thank you for sharing that. And it looks like we're almost time to close out for the night. And before I bring Cynthia back on, I want to give this opportunity to ask you all, if you have any final comments, however brief, or if we're all good, I can bring Cynthia back on. Cool. I also want to thank everyone for watching tonight, and give another shout out to our stellar panel. I've learned a lot, and I know Cynthia's probably been taking tons of notes. And we hope, yeah, there they are. And so we hope to continue these relationships and coalition building across the state. And I'll hand it off to Cynthia.
Actually, can I just jump in real quick? I also, I want to say thank you to everyone, the panelists, and, you know, Rochester is only so far away, so I hope we could continue these conversations and build these relationships and learn from one another as we move forward. So thank you.
Robert, Dejan, Damian, of course, Victor, Ahmed, thank you so much for your comments. We are determined to lean in more and understand more about Buffalo, which has its own unique concerns, and look for representation on our board, etc., regarding, just as Victor has done, pushing us on upstate issues. And I will tell you, as I said a long time ago, part of the reason that the new Pride agenda was formed, our focus on communities of color, transgender, non-conforming, non-binary experience, but also upstate. What is really not being addressed upstate. And those of us that have helped found the new Pride agenda have been very committed to that. And some of us that are older and white and of another generation, we're learning from those of you that are younger and activists and people of color and energized, but we're committed to bringing our, old-fashioned Rolodexes, our resources, our access regarding your issues. I've taken 3 pages of notes in so many things. The authenticity of what you spoke about with the demonstrations, what happened in June, Black Lives Matter, of course, the transgender Black leadership, which still is not really understood in so many movements. It's still not quite, I believe, really entirely acknowledged in our community. The cultural change you're talking about, the need for inclusiveness, the lack of transportation upstate, the lack of implementation. One of our issues we wanted to go out with strong, in addition to implementation of gender, was implementation of DASA, dignity for all students, like capturing young people and how they're being discriminated against in schools and otherwise, things that Robert and others of you addressed. I felt tremendous energy regarding the whole discussion of how the tragedy of Black Lives Matter has affected the energy of the movement. It's such a drag that that's how it happens, and yet that is how it has happened again in our country. But we better take this and do some fucking social change, because it's like some of us are getting too old and aging out. It's like we have to stay with this. And I've been involved in many movements. I've been involved in mental health, Community Mental Health Act years ago, and marriage equality, and things around domestic violence. It is possible. It is possible, you guys. It's possible to affect the bureaucracy and make change. It really, truly is possible. And we all have to stay with it. Your comments regarding LGBT and LI representation. We at New Pride Agenda could not agree with you more on that issue. And it's about, as you say, there's urgency, there's an approach, there's demand of productivity regarding representation, and we want to see more LGBT representation. We want to see younger representation, some communities of color, but we want to see it with a value system that we support. And I don't care if you're an old white guy or an old white woman and you're elected and you're in our corner and you will push it, we are with you. And if you're a young person, you grab that energy and you got the energy, and you go with it, you win, we support you. How do you pivot to get more in your community? We're with you. So I think this was enormously helpful. I will tell you, we're barely in existence. You talk about Rolodexes and finance. We're just living really kind of month to month, because we haven't gone to the old traditional communities. We are engaged with you, the grassroots community, people on the line. And we are hiring a new executive director. It will be a person representative of your community. And we are committed to continue with our advocacy, our education, our leadership development and service, to stay with you and not go away. And so I thank you for your contributions and my 3 pages of notes. Of course, Ahmed and I and our board will be at it again tomorrow. You know, when we met with Buffalo, you know, a few months ago, they said, "Are you ever coming back?" And it's like, yeah, we're coming back. But we're coming to you to listen and learn and take it as we know how to do at the next level of advocacy. And so I thank you for your contribution. You are all teachers and mentors, and this conversation will be continued. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, everyone. Again, have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.